Today's topic is creative nonfiction, and if you've got 5 minutes, I've got 5 tips to help you to improve your creative or narrative nonfiction. Writing creative nonfiction or narrative nonfiction is arguably closer in tenor and approach to fiction writing than it is to other kinds of nonfiction writing, prescriptive nonfiction in particular. In other words, the best creative or narrative nonfiction writers realize that their work is more powerful and more effective if it employs the literary techniques of fiction writing. Now, as my regular viewers know, I started my writing career almost 4 decades ago as a nonfiction writer. And most of my work at the time was actually prescriptive. But over the years, I have done some narrative nonfiction writing. I've written a memoir, and I've actually, in one or two of my prescriptive nonfiction books, I've actually used the technique of interweaving some anecdotal storytelling within the prescriptive aspects of the book. For example, the book Patient Power that I wrote many years ago, co-wrote with my husband, who happens to be a physician, is primarily a prescriptive nonfiction book. However, it uses a story that's interwoven throughout the book to tell the story, to illustrate the points that are made in the prescriptive aspects of the book. So sometimes they can be combined slightly, but you have to be very, very careful about it. So let's start off by defining creative or narrative nonfiction. And here's my definition. Creative or narrative nonfiction is a genre of writing that uses literary techniques to tell true stories. It's really that simple. So what it really does is it combines the factual telling of a story with the techniques of fiction writing, like character development, story arc, scene setting, dialogue, emotional response. All of these become part of how you write powerful creative nonfiction. There are 3 key features of creative nonfiction, and here they are. The first one, of course, is that the work has a factual basis. This goes without saying. It's nonfiction, so it must be based on facts. The second characteristic is that it employs narrative techniques, as we've just talked about. And the third characteristic is that, unlike prescriptive nonfiction, it does include elements of reflection and subjectivity, and these come from you, the writer. Now, before we get into my 5 tips, let's go through a list of the kinds of things I'm talking about. What types of books fall into the creative nonfiction category? And the first one that comes to mind, of course, is memoir. Memoir focuses on personal experiences and reflections, which is different than the second type, which is, of course, an autobiography. An autobiography, unlike a memoir, which usually focuses on a particular aspect of somebody's life, is usually a kind of a year-by-year chronological, blow-by-blow, this is what happened in my life. It covers an entire life, an autobiography, as opposed to a memoir. But both are creative nonfiction. Then, of course, there would be personal essays. Personal essays usually include personal anecdote, which is what it's based on, that it reflects on larger elements in society, larger kind of themes. Then there's a biography, which is a detailed account of someone's life, but it's not written by the person whose life it's about. It's written by somebody else. You could write a biography of a person in history, for example. And then there's literary journalism, where journalistic facts are illuminated by vivid descriptions and narrative arcs. Then there's travel writing, nature writing, profiles, which would be in magazines or on blog posts these days, cultural criticism, historical narrative, food writing, science writing, true crime, and epistolary nonfiction. Epistolary nonfiction is based on personal documents like diaries, for example. Now for my 5 tips. Tip number 1, before you begin, develop a deep understanding of what constitutes nonfiction as a genre. What I mean by this is to read widely in the genre. Read every memoir, every type of nonfiction that relates to what you're interested in. Read the really good, really accomplished creative and narrative nonfiction writers. Get to know the genre before you begin. Tip number 2, find a unique angle on the truth. Don't just tell your readers a story that they've heard in the news, for example. Find a new way of looking at it, a new frame within which to see the story. So figure out what your frame is. Of course, your story is going to be grounded in reality, but you want to find a specific angle, and that's what the framing is all about. Tip number 3, use storytelling tools and techniques. This is what makes creative or narrative nonfiction different from prescriptive nonfiction. It's using these techniques that would be used normally by novelists. We're talking about things like character development, sensory details, dialogue. What you want to do is immerse your readers in the experience. For example, if you're writing a biography of someone, that individual should become a character who comes alive on the page, just like the character in a novel would for readers, so that they can identify with them, that they can feel emotionally moved by him. Tip number 4, build a narrative arc. Now, I've talked before about how to structure fiction, and this is the kind of thing I'm talking about here. You need to use the techniques of a novelist to create that narrative arc, to tell a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. What you need to do within that narrative arc is to build tension and raise the stakes as it goes along. This should never be a didactic telling of a story, one fact after the other. Build that story using that narrative arc so that you can engage the readers in the story. Tip number 5, balance facts with reflection. Now, if you as the writer include reflections, insights, interpretations to the telling of the story, this adds dimension to it. It builds on the objective, factual information. But you need to be careful that you don't overdo this and it becomes less factual and more focused on your particular perspective on it. People are still expecting it to be a true story. And when they find out that a story that they thought was true really massage the facts in a direction that the writer wanted, then you lose credibility. So you need to maintain that credibility by sticking to the facts, but by adding on to that an element of reflection and subjectivity. Because you're going to tell the story through your own frame. In the end, you have to remember that it's your story. You're not writing this story to tell people how to do something, for example, which is what prescriptive nonfiction is all about. And that's going to be the topic of our next episode. Happy writing. Subscribe to Write, Fix, Repeat, and maybe I can help you improve your writing knowledge and skills. 5 tips at a time.